All right, let's dive into the story of how language itself can become a political force. We're going to unpack how the words, the metaphors, and the stories used during the Brexit campaign didn't just describe the debate, they actively shaped it.
I mean, that sounds a little dramatic, right? But political debates are often won or lost long before the real arguments even begin. They're won in the battle over the words we choose, because the right word can frame an entire conversation, creating heroes, villains, and a sense of destiny all by itself.
So, to really get a grip on the Brexit campaign, you have to start with the power of a brand new word that basically just appeared in our vocabulary. It was simple, it was catchy, and it turned out to be incredibly powerful.
And that brings us to our first big idea, the word that kicked this whole thing off, and the power of what linguists call a neologism, which is really just a fancy term for a newly coined word. Think of it like the linguistic spark that can light a huge political fire.
You see, neologisms aren't just clever wordplay. They're so effective because they act like these little packages, bundling up complex ideas with all sorts of emotional undertones. They influence how we feel about something before we've even had a chance to think it through. And Brexit is the perfect case study here. It's a blend, what's known as a portmanteau word, and it just sounds so clean and simple. What it does is frame this massive, complicated political process as a single, decisive event, an exit. It basically turned a policy debate into a memorable brand. And from this one word, a whole family of labels just exploded onto the scene, creating identities and, yeah, even weapons. But look at the difference here. Supporters of leaving had a few options, but those who wanted to remain were often hit with these derogatory terms like Ramoner or Romaniac. This imbalance in the language really helped to frame one side as patriotic adventurers and the other as just whiners. It shaped perceptions from the very beginning. And believe me, that was no accident. The term Brexiteer was specifically chosen to bring up these romantic, heroic images. It's not a neutral word at all. It suggests a swashbuckling adventurer fighting for a noble cause, which is a way more compelling character than just a leaver. So you can see how this strategy builds. You start with single words, and from there you build entire worlds out of metaphor. Because once you've named the teams, you need to describe the game they're playing. The Leave campaign absolutely loved this metaphor of the EU as a sinking ship. And it's such a brilliant persuasion tactic because it doesn't talk to your logical brain. It talks to your primal instinct for survival. When a ship is sinking, you don't stand around debating the finer points of navigation. You get in a lifeboat, now. But what's so fascinating is how the exact same story, the Titanic, was used by both sides to argue the complete opposite. Was the EU the ship that was doomed? Or was a post-Brexit Britain the one sailing off alone into icy waters? The power of the metaphor is that it forces you to pick a side in the story it's telling. And it wasn't just about ships. Water, in general, became this huge recurring theme, and it was often used to create a sense of fear, of being overwhelmed. Words like tsunami, floods, and waves frame things like immigration not as manageable policies, but as terrifying natural disasters that threaten to completely swamp the country.
So the big question is, why are these metaphors so incredibly effective? What makes them stick in our brains so well? Well, to get that, we need to peek under the hood of our own decision-making process.
Psychologist Jonathan Haidt has this fantastic way of explaining it. He says our mind is like a rider on top of a giant elephant. The elephant is our intuition, our fast, automatic gut feelings. The rider is our rational mind, and most of the time, the rider isn't actually steering. It's just coming up with excuses for where the elephant already decided to go. And this is a perfect example of language aimed straight at the elephant, completely bypassing the rider. This tweet isn't making a policy argument. It's a powerful gut punch, appealing to deep moral feelings like loyalty to our heroes and the sanctity of a dying wish. It makes you feel that a position is right instead of thinking about it. Okay, so when you start mixing all these things together, the powerful new words, the framing metaphors, these deep psychological triggers, you're not just making arguments anymore. You're telling sweeping stories. You're creating grand allegories with very clear heroes and villains. I mean, listen to this one from Boris Johnson. He so skillfully framed the vote not as some boring policy choice, but as a heroic struggle for freedom. By calling it Independence Day, he basically cast the EU as an oppressive empire and Britain as the righteous freedom fighter. It's a movie plot, and it's incredibly powerful. Then there was this other really common metaphor that kept popping up, the relationship between the UK and the EU as a marriage. Now, that seems harmless enough on the surface, but it immediately sets the stage for a very particular kind of ending. And of course, that ending is a messy divorce. That one frame leads directly to talk of a huge divorce bill and fights over who gets what. It automatically defines the separation as something that's going to be confrontational, expensive, and emotional, just like a real divorce. But on the flip side, the Leave campaign was working hard to reframe that relationship into something else entirely. They wanted to suggest something less binding, less emotional than a marriage, maybe more like a friendship or even just a business partnership, things that are much easier to walk away from.
And this is such a clever switch, right? Here, the EU are just business partners, so parting ways seems simple, logical. It lets Britain leave a transactional relationship in order to return to its true family, the Commonwealth. This completely changes the emotional stakes of the separation.
Okay, so let's pull all these threads together. After looking at the language of Brexit, what's the underlying toolkit that was being used so effectively? What we've really uncovered is a kind of blueprint for persuasion. First, you coin a simple, memorable word. Second, you use powerful metaphors to frame the world. Third, you speak directly to the elephant, to people's gut feelings. And finally, you weave it all together into a grand story. It's not about facts and figures, it's about crafting a reality through language. And here's the really important part. These techniques are not unique to one campaign or one country. This blueprint, coining words, framing reality, speaking to our intuitions, and telling big stories, is pretty much a core part of how political debate works everywhere today. So I'll leave you with this thought. Now that you've seen the blueprint, now that you know the tools, what hidden messages, what stories are you going to start hearing in the news you read and the speeches you listen to tomorrow? Because that language is always, always at work.